Hey everybody, my name is Brendan. I'm part of Renew Theaters. If you're watching tonight, you're a follower or member of either our Ambler, Highway, County, or Princeton Garden Theater. Um, so thank you for joining us tonight for this very special Q&A with the filmmakers from Feast of the Epiphany. We have Michael Koreski, Jeff Reggert, Faria Saman, and Caitlin Mayberg. So sorry if I butchered any of your names, last names, first names. But thank you for joining us. And I know we were supposed to be doing this last Wednesday, but I know all of you guys live in the New York area, mainly the Brooklyn area. How have the protests been in your area so far?
I know that it's affecting people in cities and outside of cities all over the country, which is really amazing. I don't want to act as though we're only affected because we're living in New York, but the four of us all happen to live relatively close to each other, and we're close, and I think that informs Feast of the Epiphany, our relationship and proximity to each other. And we all happen to be very close to one of the sort of main hubs of protest activity in the city, which I know I don't want to speak for everyone, but I've been extremely grateful for in a way to feel that energy, to see that, it won't end after a day or 2 days, that every day we can walk outside of the house and say, like, I get to participate if I want to, in in taking up space and trying to speak to justice. So that's been wonderful. It also means that there's really a surreal level of police presence in our neighborhood, and one that is at times hostile or at the very least uh, harassing. So I think that last week, in addition to just sort of all psychologically processing that, even as non-Black people, what that means, the sort of weight of this experience. We also felt like it was very hard to talk about anything else. It was very hard to participate in anything other than the uprising. So we wanted to sort of make space for that, and for more conversation and participation in the Black Lives Matter movement. And we're still, I know, all committed to that, and hope that the fight continues, but also excited to talk about the contributions that we're trying to make in the world outside of that as well.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. That it's incredible, and I really, really appreciate hearing that. And want to dive in and talk about Feast of the Epiphany. It was a film that when I saw it, I was completely taken aback and a little bit blown away by how much there's just so much to it. And I want to dive into some questions. So most of these questions are going to be general. So whoever wants to, take the ball and run with it, go ahead. But and also for the people that are watching, if you have any questions, please leave some in the comments, and I can pass that along to the filmmakers. So I want to know, how did all three of you meet, and where did the collaboration on Feast begin?
Oh wow, our relationships all go back. I mean, it's so long at this point. I mean, we met first. I met Michael first, probably right back in 2002. And Michael and I founded a film journal together called Reverse Shot. And so that was the kind of like the first link. And then Fariha and I worked together at Magnolia Pictures. So we met in 2006.
I was 21 or 22
and
when you found me.
And we all met Caitlin in 2000, and I want to say 13.
That seems accurate to me. A thing I love about Brooklyn and the independent film community of sort of all budget sides and all genres is that I keep thinking, I keep referring to it as like birthday party culture. And I met Jeff and Fariha at a birthday party for someone else who runs an outdoor film series in the city and now internationally. And then through them met Michael. But they're, you know, I've been around the world talking about the like Brooklyn birthday party film culture, and a lot of the most meaningful parts of it to me are in this little screen with me right now.
And I think it's meaningful to the nature of the film of Feast of the Epiphany, which is very much about gathering and maintaining relationships, as challenging and imperfect as they can be in moments that are hard for you. And I think even the way that we met and the way that the film was conceived, which I think I always like for Michael to take that question because he's the screenwriter of the scripted portion, that, you know, it very much, the film is infused with that kind of length of relationship and affection for one another.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, if you want to go back to actually the genesis of the project, we always find it a little hard to pinpoint the exact date, but we can sort of trace it back to our shared love of the farmers market in Brooklyn, because there's such a farmers market element to the film, and we just kind of remember, without putting an actual date on it, we'd like to say maybe 2011 is when we first started coming up with the basic conception of the film, but we were like wandering around the farmers market, which is very close to where we all live, and, you know, just picking up some delicious produce, some fresh greens, and thought, isn't it interesting to think where this food comes from? And isn't it interesting to think that you could make a film that was split into part fiction, part documentary? So you'd have a very scripted, obviously written, obviously acted, obviously, you know, performed, almost play-like, is kind of how we thought of it at first, half of the film. And then wouldn't it be interesting for that to break off completely and go into a documentary? And the documentary would implicitly, without hopefully not doing too much underlining, would be about where that food came from, the food that is so integral to the first half of the film. So that was like a basic concept that we had, but we also never really felt the need to, or we didn't feel the need, but we maybe didn't feel the proper inspiration to actually make it a reality until a few years later, when we had gone through some personal losses. And when I say we, I'm talking most about me and Fariha. And that was how the script started coming together. The script, again, we wouldn't have done it if it was just this clever little conceit. We wanted to do something that was meaningful. And when we joined up with Caitlin, who also had experienced some very serious loss in her life, it just all started to really come together. And yeah, the experience of writing it, casting it, shooting it, it's you don't realize until it's all over that you've actually worked through your own emotions. It becomes like a form of therapy, actually.
Yeah, and I found, especially now, I have a question about the first half, where if when you begin the film, it looks like you're going through these auditions. Was that the actual auditions that the actors went through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was never intended to be used, but we filmed it because so prior to this film, Fariha and I have made a few documentary films together, and I think we have this impulse to just capture stuff and just be rolling. And we thought, well, maybe this will be useful as we are kind of thinking about who we want to eventually cast in these different roles. We can look back over the footage, we can see their answers, et cetera, et cetera. But there were just moments from that casting process that sort of stuck with us, especially the very first shot with Sarah / Jesse looking in the mirror. And, it's just it's one of those images that it felt so good and so strong that it was sort of like, well, can the film bear it? Can we make space in the film for this? And so it wasn't until deep into the edit that we started sort of playing with this material and seeing how it could actually function in the movie, even though it did inflect the script even earlier, right? I mean, because some of the details from that ended up making their way into Michael's writing.
Yeah, there were a few reasons, and actually it was very hotly debated when we decided to include it. And I'll say that I initially, like, I didn't understand how it would work. I had to live with it for a long time, and that sort of process of discovery was a big part of the film in general, but particularly the editing. And we felt, and we hope that this came across, that for one thing, it sets you up to understand that you're going to be surprised in this film. I think that idea of like expectation and what kinds of things are going to happen, and that we are playing with fiction and nonfiction, as Jeff said. It felt good to include that up front, but it also addressed an issue that we were dealing with, where because we wanted to immediately immerse people in the relationships of the film, because we didn't deal with backstory really, there was a kind of a longer period of time that it took people to become attached to the characters or feel that they understood them. And it was interesting how something so small can make such a huge difference. It was interesting to us that we could resolve a scripted problem with a documentary solution, and that as soon as you heard about these people's lives, it's just impossible, the way the human brain works, not to then place that on top of what you see in them, just as we started to incorporate their real life stories when we were filming in ways that weren't initially in the script. So I think it also gave the characters this depth that didn't require a lot of time or a lot of kind of pandering. It just gave you a little bit more about them. And I know that the actors, a number of them have mentioned that they've never done an audition before where they were asked a lot of personal questions. And to my doc filmmaker brain, I'm like, why not? Like, why wouldn't somebody immediately ask you all about you and your life? And a lot of them also talked about how their lives have changed since making the film. And so the inclusion of something from their personal life has made it more poignant for them too, to see this record of a time when they talked about their relationships and what they ate and who their friends were. And a lot evolves in a few years.
And so I want to move on. We actually got two questions, so I want to dive into those from the audience. These are two questions from Jesse. I'll start with his first question. Were the two halves originally envisioned as a single film, or did they evolve as independent projects that got merged together?
Always envisioned as a single film with two halves. That's a question that we've been asked before. It does come up, and it's an interesting one because each half does function as its own short film. But we always wanted the idea was always for there to be one emotional arc connecting both halves. So even though the scripted half is written to end on a particular emotional note, and I think it does have an ending of a sort, it also leaves you emotionally hanging, and it leaves you wanting more. It should hopefully leave you wanting more. And the second half of the film, the documentary part, is supposed to be where your expectations, hopes, desires, emotions go. So it was always conceived as a movie about going from the city to the country, going from one type of community to another, going from winter to spring. And then it turned out, actually, because we shot all the seasons, going through all 4 seasons. So it was always one experience.
And the second question from Jesse was, which section was made first, and your roles as filmmakers, did they change between the fictional and documentary sections?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question.
We actually, we shot it almost exactly in the order in which you see it. So the auditions were the first thing we filmed, obviously, and then the little dream sequence at the beginning of the narrative section was the last thing we shot. We did shoot the narrative first. It was in the winter. It was late January, early February of 2016, and then we shot on the farm starting in May of 2016. Then we went back in August, September, and then again last in November of that year. So the production actually took, it was extended over the course of about 11 months.
And
it's important what you see.
I think that the ways our roles changed are ambiguous and kind of hard to spell out. I mean, besides the obvious in terms of, there are certain kinds of needs on a scripted film, and they differ a lot, particularly for a producer like Caitlin. I think that you're the kinds of things that you had to address in scripted versus doc change a lot. And I'd love to hear you talk about that a little more. But it was such a sort of organic process, especially having a lot of collaborators and collaborators that you're close to, that it was sort of more like addressing a need and trying to like hear each other and respond to what was unfolding. I feel like the change was more personal, if I can be a little sentimental for a moment. It was like the process of seeing what happened in the documentary portion totally differently, because it was through the lens of the scripted portion that we had already filmed, looking for these kinds of moments of connection and resonance was really meaningful. And I think that was a much more significant change to me than the shift in the process of filmmaking.
Yeah, and I actually have a question for Caitlin about, as far as producing. You were a producer for both a narrative portion of the film and documentary portion. I know you have a background in producing narrative and documentary films. So what was it like to do that on one single film? What were the challenges as a producer on your end?
I think that got my start in are you hearing me?
Yes.
Great. Then my computer is a liar. I got my start in nonfiction television, and after that have moved sort of very fluidly between scripted and documentary work. But I think of myself in my heart as a nonfiction producer, whatever you want to call that. So I think that the biggest challenge, and it was a lovely privilege to do it, was sort of translating the scripted space for nonfiction filmmakers who were like very confident in a certain space. And I think that there's a lot of magic of discovery in documentary that is how we wound up with the start of the film, which is so exciting to me. And then there's some other elements that it's sort of like, no, we have to ask SAG if we can use those audition tapes. We can't just put them in the film. And so it's not necessarily a challenge. And I think that I offend a lot of scripted producers because I think that type of work is, it's basically like putting all of your ducks in a row and then the ducks go sing an opera. Whereas documentary is a little bit more of like, are there ducks? Can we find some ducks? And then one of the ducks is singing an opera and one of them is tap dancing. And then you sort of move forward with what you want to follow with that film. I'm like really into birds right now, but yeah, I don't know. I think that it's I innately trust Jeff Freha and Michael, and it was a true like privilege to work with them. And I think that it's cool to see the different sensibilities playing off of each other, and how these little things just sort of like made the film sing in a very unique way that someone that had like one specific either documentary or scripted experience wouldn't necessarily have activated.
And I do have a question. I guess I'm directing this towards Michael, but anybody else that would like to chime in? Were there any films or works of art that inspired the writing for the fictional portion of the film?
Yeah, absolutely. So the main inspiration, and this kind of came to me later, like it was like when I first started writing the script, it really was just going on pure instinct and this concept and the emotions that I was feeling at the time. And then at a certain point I realized, oh my God, I'm basically writing the dead. James Joyce is the dead. You know, I mean, it all takes place in one night. It's a dinner party. It has casual conversation that seems to be about nothing. And then it suddenly segues into talk about mortality. And that's kind of where the whole idea for the snow came from. I remember originally writing this and not thinking about snow, and then realizing, oh, I'm kind of doing the dead. This should end in snowfall, which it turned out to be a major point of the film. So thank God for James Joyce for many reasons. But that really is, I mean, the story is one of my favorite. It's probably my favorite, short story ever written. But then also the movie version by John Huston from 1987 is complete masterpiece, and we did screen that for the crew. That was the only movie that we actually screened for the crew before we shot. And then other than that, I'm a big Terrence Davies fan, so a lot of the aesthetic of the movie the ideas of the aesthetic that I had in my head that we all talked about. And of course, it's not just that, it's so many things, but a lot of that came from movies like The Long Day Closes and Distant Voices, Still Lives. Some of the camera movements and just the unrealness of it, of some of the performance style and the positioning of the actors is very Davies. But I think those were the main, for me, the main thoughts. I know that Jeff and Freya have other.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about John Dietmann, the Shanta Ackerman film, in terms of like that movie has such great cooking, like it was wonderfully long sequences of cooking, and we talked. It's interesting the way influences kind of seep their way into the film and become translated into something else. Like we shot many long takes of Nikki just cooking and doing things, but in the film that we ended up making, it ended up, the cooking ends up happening pretty quickly. Flowers of Shanghai, we talked a lot about with our DP about the way that the scenes around tables in the brothels in Flowers of Shanghai, the way that they're lit and the way the lighting kind of makes the faces glow and bounce off the table. That was something that we looked at. I don't know, I'm trying to remember other things.
There's also sort of an uncanny experience where there are films that resonate for you or for other people who write about or just watch the film that we hadn't considered during. And it's kind of nice to be part of this, part of different kinds of ways of approaching subjects. So like, people will make comparisons to other films that involve a dinner party. Somebody actually mentioned Karen Kusama's The Invitation to me the other day, which is just about, sort of like slow, tense conversation. And we hadn't considered that at all. But like, I love that there are variations on ways of trying to address a particular kind of experience. And I think a lot of the films that come up, including Personal Shopper by Olivier Assayas, which we didn't really talk about at all while making the film. It came out after, but now it makes total sense to me that it's sort of like a resonant film. I think it's, again, because we were processing a lot of what happens in the film through experiences of grief, experiences of, sort of family and chosen family. It's kind of, I find it comforting actually to kind of look for other films that deal with these questions, these big questions, and see a multiplicity of ways of doing that. So there was also like an after inspiration kind of effect.
Yeah, like The Invitation. Apparently, I cannot believe that. I'm like never gonna forget that. That movie really freaked me out. I liked it, actually. I liked it a lot. I've seen it more than once. Like it freaked me out so much that I'm like, everybody watch this.
I watched it because you recommended I watch it.
Did you? It's like Share My Trauma, everybody.
Share My Trauma is also an alternate title for Feast of the Epiphany.
I recommended it to my mom.
The Invitation?
The Invitation.
Oh, jeez. How'd she feel about it?
She thought it was interesting. She liked it.
Well, one of the first things we say in that dialogue with the actor, or the voiceover, I guess, that you hear from the auditions is like talking about tension and building tension. And that's, of course, exactly what The Invitation is this like tightening coil that just unleashes finally.
Yes.
Yeah. And ours does in a totally different way. It's the tightening coil, and then you kind of want the release, and we don't give you that kind of release. There's a musical number, and then you go to the farm, and as Michael said, and Michael, I love hearing you talk about this. Like, don't we all wish that there was a neat resolution to those feelings, to the tightening coil? But you don't get that when people leave you. You don't get to have that. This is the experience that we sometimes are left to sit with, and that's the reality of living.
Yeah, I've heard people say when we get to the farm, I was hoping that the characters would come up and join the dinner at the end. And I always like that. It's like, sorry.
Nope, not this movie.
And yeah, I definitely agree. I felt like watching that film, the emotion that I felt with that when you go to the farm where everything just rises and there's all this tension that builds, and you get to the farm and you're just thrown into another world. I never felt anything like that watching any other film. So definitely kudos to you guys for doing that, because it was one of my favorite moments I feel like I've seen in a long time in a film.
Thank you.
And how I felt through it.
And we have to give a lot of credit to our editor, Ben Garchar, who crafted that transition so wonderfully. And, so many things in films change over the course of making them. You do a cut, you change everything in the cut. But for whatever reason, that sequence of just a handful of shots is not different than when he showed it to us the first time, because it was just so right. I think maybe at one point we suggested swapping a shot and we tried it. We went back to what he had done already. And it just worked. It worked exactly perfectly.
So I want to actually talk about the farm and Roxbury Farm. How did you guys approach them, and how long did I know you talked a little bit about your process of shooting there. Just talk a bit, just go a little bit more in depth, I guess, just about how you approached them, how they became involved, why that was the farm that was chosen to be a part of the film.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really hard to convince a farm to let you film, or at least we found that. We sent emails to, I feel like it was dozens of farms at one point.
We visited a handful too.
Yeah,
we
only a
went
couple
upstate.
let us actually look at them. And I think when we went to Roxbury, we really, it was the right size. It felt good being there. There seemed like a lot of different kinds of visual environments. We loved that it was run by two women, especially since the main characters of the first half are two women. There seemed like some potential mirroring. We didn't know exactly how and if that might play out, but it seemed like there was some potential there. We didn't know a lot about them. We didn't know that at the time that Roxbury was one of the founders of the CSA movement in this country, which, thematically was a really nice thing to learn. And it's not really in the film, but knowing that was meaningful to us. We didn't know that they read Rudolf Steiner every morning before they set off to work. We found that out on the first day we were filming, and we're totally thrown, but in that great way that you're thrown when you're making documentaries and you stumble across something that is so perfect and wonderful. We just really liked them. We liked Jodie a lot. We just saw Jodie a few weeks ago for the first time in a little while. She came to a Q&A that we did online for the Museum of the Moving Image. It was great to kind of check in with her. But, we had this idea that we were just going to shoot for 5 or 6 days in the spring, and then we would have the movie. And then at the end of those 6 days, I remember the farmers just kind of being like, God, it's been great having you here, but you haven't seen anything. We haven't done anything yet. You should come back in harvest time. And we all talked about it. And we said, well, can we, does this make sense thematically? Can we do this? And I think we all just sort of thought, well, why not? We're not in any hurry to finish the film. Let's go back up there. And then we went back in the summer, and they said, oh, did you know we're having a 25th anniversary celebration in a month? And we said, we did not know that. Let's come back for that. And by that point, it was mid-September of 2016. And it felt like, yeah, we should just come back for a couple of days in November and just sort of finish out the year.
I have a question. We have an audience question. So the audience question is: are the job roles decided first, or do they develop organically as you begin to work on the project?
Which roles? I just missed the.
Are the roles on set?
Sure.
Are they decided first amongst you, or do they develop organically as you begin to work on the project itself?
Both. We were very adaptable. I mean, yeah, in a way that honestly, like the process of making this and our ways of relating to each other mirrored and were shaped by the way that the film functions, which is keep your eyes and ears open and kind of let the process tell you what makes sense. In the same way that, as Jeff said, hearing that those Rudolf Steiner passages and this discussion about the cosmos and how things are connected, it taught us what the film was about and how to talk about what the film was about in a way that we were unable to fully articulate or grasp when we went in. And I think that this is, as far as roles and even just scheduling and other kind of putting together of a film, is also comes a little bit from a filmmaking mindset, which is you're going to have a lot of ideas and a lot of thoughts about how things are going to work, and then at least half of that is just not going to be the case. So we knew a couple of things, but I think ideas of like, well, you can talk to the actors in this portion, and you should talk to the DP in this portion. I think that really is only necessary if you're not listening to each other and don't have kind of harmony about what makes sense when. And we had never all worked together before. So it was a pleasure to discover that a lot of our plans and plotting could be thrown out the window. yeah, and we just, yeah, kind of, there's a way in which you hear the ideas that are on the table and understand what makes sense or what feels right. And we did kind of, for how compressed a time frame we had to shoot, um, allowed for a lot of discussion with the actors as well, just a little bit of back and forth to make sure, like, okay, this feels good going into it. So yeah, we tried to make it very collaborative.
And another honest question we got was, how did you end up resolving any conflicts that arose? Was that decision made by consensus or majority vote?
The main conflict that we had is Jeff's running joke during the editing process that he would switch the parts, and then it would be documentary first and then scripted after, and we never resolved it. Every time we said it, even though he was joking, we all got a little bit mad because it was so stressful to even think about it that way.
It was actually a harmonious, really harmonious shoot. Otherwise, we didn't have a lot of we didn't have problems on the set at all. We had, and even in post production is where there were more discussions about what this should look like, what the shape should be. But there were never any like knockdown, drag out fights.
No, I mean,
Yeah, and I find debate during the editing process to be super productive, and that if those debates are heated, then then it forces you to think through why you're doing what you're doing, and why you're defending a certain position. And also, like, especially when you're working with digital, if we're shooting in film and editing on film, that might be different, but there's a little bit of, I think we all wanted to be open-minded and have some playfulness in the process anyway. So it's really like, well, why not? Maybe I disagree with you heartily, but let's give it a try and then step back and see how it feels.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, but I wouldn't even call it conflict, but there was definitely healthy debate in that time frame.
Mm-hmm.
I think that successful and harmonious co-directorships are rare. I think that 3 directors on a project is exceedingly rare. And I will say with like the full honesty of my heart that it is exactly as you're saying, we have no skeletons in the closet. And from as the only non-director, it was never something that needed to be mediated. And I think that is a testament to the fact that everyone in the trio had worked together in sort of a different form in some way or another. And so all of the potential sort of landmines in collaboration had been worked out in some other form. And so creatively collaborating in this way was not unknown territory.
I really trust these guys, like I mean, they also, and just to give them a little credit, we're all praising each other right now. I wish I could say something controversial, but I can't. But they had, again, I was coming into this, like I'd worked with them, with Jeff and Fariha before on other things, editing, criticism, other kinds of smaller projects. We'd never made a film together, but Jeff and Fariha had been collaborators on some really wonderful documentaries, including some like pretty major feature documentaries that I really love. And so not only did I have an incredible, admiration for their work, but I was really impressed by their ability to work through conflicts in a way where they really listen to each other. And I'm not saying like, oh, there were that many conflicts, but when any kind of conversation came up that could have been a conflict, they're really good at diffusing it early. I remember, and I wasn't quite there yet. Sometimes I could, at the beginning, I remember, seeing something. I don't remember what it was. It might have been something in the editor, some design something, and my instinct is to be like, oh, I hate that. That's terrible. And I think Jennifer are like, okay, we don't say that. It's not productive to see you hate something. Everything is worth consideration. I mean, it's just that kind of, learning on the job for me was really important. Good conversation. We had a
good conversation. We are all lucky to be able to do this. And making a film is always hard, no matter if it's, this movie didn't cost very much. We made it over a long period of time with friends in a small collaborative way. It was hard and had its own challenges. Like, I just worked on American Factory, which was like a much bigger production, much more stressful timeline, much more stressful apparatus around it. Like every movie that you make is a challenge. And so if you can go through those challenges, sort of as open and honest and caring as you possibly can, and try to make it be fun, as well. It's just like, it's not worth it. I mean, the return for us is it's just not worth it if you're not enjoying the process.
I think it's also a good example of, or not example, but a testament to just try something. Like something like we had this idea. This idea would not necessarily have appealed to people in our head. We're like, okay, we'll try this thing. It's a little strange. Maybe nobody will ever watch it. And that was actually kind of liberating because we were just like, let's just do this because we believe in it.
Yeah,
And we
it
did.
happens.
And I got one final question for tonight. Could you talk? Do you have any upcoming projects that you're all working on right now?
Well, there's a bunch of stuff, but Fariha and I are the main thing that we're working on right now is I'll show off some of our stars. We're working on a television series about animals that are endangered because humans consider them ugly, and so a show that sort of looks at looks at and questions our assumptions about beauty and why that wonders why that actually matters and how we treat treat anything, but much less a different creature.
Which one is that?
This is the tarsier, and I've got the Yangtze softshell tortoise here. Sorry, I'm getting some screen glare, but I have a whole gallery of these guys up here that we're gonna hopefully make a TV series about.
It's called Nobody Loves Me, which I really like to tell people, along with the tagline, which is "Should only the cute survive." And then I'm also Jeff and I both also moonlight as producers. We don't have Caitlin's deep experience, but I'm working on 2 projects where I'm producing for other directors. One is for Eric Metzger and Steve Mang, who made the film Crime and Punishment, which is a really interesting film that's available on Hulu that I think also resonates with this political moment. Mm-hmm. And it's a sort of nonpartisan look at sort of a time capsule of Trump's 4 years in office that we've experienced, and trying to see this moment in terms of very broad range of people's lives and more intimate moments with their families, how it affects our relationships and marriages and education and these sorts of things. And then also I'm producing a project for a director named PJ Raval, who's also whose work I respect a lot. But it's part of a sort of art activation in which on the 3rd and 4th of July in over 80 sort of immigration-related buildings around the country. So detention centers, courthouses, transferring facilities. We've partnered with 80 artists who are and having a phrase that they've designed for that particular location to be sky typed. So these people who do skywriting, typically to write "Will you marry me?" or "Geico, Geico, Geico," will now be putting messages up in the sky, drawing attention to these often very hidden centers, saying things like "I am here" and "freedom." And it's been a real pivot and different kind of project for me.
And I've completed a couple scripts, full scripts this time, not shorts or half movies or however you want to call it, that I think we're all looking to get off the ground at some point soon. And but the biggest project I'm working on is a book. Actually, I have a book coming out next year that is about it's hard to say. It's about my relationship with my mother and how that feeds into my taste of film, and how all of our tastes are created by external factors and things we might not normally think about. But it's about movies of the 80s and revisiting those movies with her, and that's kind of the big thing I've been working on.
I am making one of the 20 documentaries about the pandemic, one of them. And I'm also really having a kind of a blast with this virtual cinema thing. So I have 2 other films that are doing virtual screenings right now. One is called 14. It's entirely scripted. It's directed by Dan Salit. And one is called Ambesa, directed by Mo Scarpelli, which is on Vimeo On Demand. And I also have to shout out that this is sort of like a homecoming for me. So I grew up in West Windsor, New Jersey, and got my earliest art house education at the Garden. So this is really, and none of my other movies have played there. And so I'm really, really excited to have the opportunity to bring this very special movie made by my very special friends as my local premiere of sorts.
Oh, and we'll definitely have to have you at the Garden when we're officially reopened again with one of your films, and definitely would love to have more of your work screening at our theaters in the future. And thank you so much for this gift of Feast of the Epiphany. I know the people I've talked to that have seen it have really loved it. So thank you so much again for taking the time out of your day for participating in this Q&A with us. And take care, guys. Thank you again.
You too.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah.